I sincerely appreciate the invitation to join in, and it's been a while since I've been able to do an extension meeting in Tennessee. I've done a few of these since I've come to Wisconsin, but I haven't done one for my friends there in Tennessee. Always good to get a chance to get in front of an audience there in a great volunteer state. I thought what I would do, if it's okay, I would really like to give you just a brief overview about the center, because I think, especially in the Southeast, I'm not sure how much folks know about the Dairy Forage Research Center and what we do and the impact that we have not only on dairy systems, but on forage systems across the country. So if you'll indulge me just a minute, I'll give you a brief statement about our center and what we do. We are a ARS, Agricultural Research Service research site. We have two locations, one in Madison and one in Marshfield, and there are 3 research units, and I'll talk about those research units in a moment and what they focus on. Right now we have 22 scientists and about a total of about 100 employees that work for us, either at our center at one of our buildings or at one of our research farms. So we have a location. This is our main building in Madison. This is our main building in Marshfield. This is central Wisconsin. And then this is our, in the background of this photo is one of our research dairies. We have one in Fertilization, which is just outside of Madison, and then another one in up around Marshfield in central Wisconsin as well for various topics and research endeavors. We need 2 different facilities there. To give you a pictorial of where we're at, so I'm talking to you from Madison, the lower star there. Marshfield's more central Wisconsin, about 3 hours north. A little bit cooler up here, but today we hit 92, so summer has arrived. We've been pretty cool up until that point. But I want to just briefly say something about our integrated dairy systems, and what I really want to highlight is we run the gambit from basic cell wall biology, which really focuses on better understanding the dairy animal and the forage physiology, all the way through improve the dairy forage production and feeding systems in a very applied nature. And then also finally, we look at reducing the environmental footprint of the U.S. dairy industry. So we look at it from a whole picture. We don't have silos of disciplines. We have animal scientists and soil scientists and forage folks, agronomists, but we integrate everyone together to work on this together at one time. We don't have the disciplinary silos that I had when I was at the University of Georgia. So it really allows for good collaboration among our scientists. And this is just a subset of the topics that we hit on, everything from soil health and fertility, to rumen microbiome and better understanding the dairy nutrition and the physiology responses to that, as well as all of the aspects of forage management. And this forage harvest, forage systems and management, that's the area that we'll be talking about. Our center has been around for 42 years now, and we have generated over 2,700 publications. As well as 38 reference books. We've been a major contributor to over 38 reference books now. So although you may not hear our name a lot, the reality is a lot of what we talk about in the forage world has been derived from what we've done at the Dairy Forage Research Center over the years. Okay, so advertisement over. I want to start with this fundamental statement. If you use this, and I'm talking about hay bales, if you use that incorrectly, this will be the biggest limit to your profitability of anything that you do. And no matter what you're talking about, if you're talking about goat operation, a dairy operation, a beef cattle operation, sheep, horses, whatever it might be, is if you use this incorrectly, you will pay the consequences. It is one of the biggest limits to your profitability. So I want to challenge you with a few of the top 5 mistakes that I've seen in managing hay fields. The first one is failing to count the cost. Failing to count the cost. Well, let's start with an overall budget. Now, this is my estimation based on what I've seen in talking to my family and friends in my home state of Kentucky, as well as in other areas around the country. We've kind of been keeping tabs on how costs are running. And right now, if we were to break down the total, somewhere around $185 an acre for fertilizer. It may be more than that in some cases. This assumes a bare minimum amount of fertilizer. About $45 for lime, about $95 for fuel and maintenance, $54 for pesticides, $22 for interest, $36 for labor, and a big chunk there in the fixed and management cost associated with hay production. So if you really put paper to pencil, I would challenge you to come up with a number less than what we came up with. I think that's a fairly conservative number given the prices of everything right now, and it's scary high. It's really scary high. We're talking nearly $660 an acre, roughly about $164 a ton if we're producing about 2 tons of the acre. So, every time we see those hay bales out there, I would encourage you to look at those as rolls of $100 bills, because we got a lot of money wrapped up in those bales, and we need to make the best out of them. And I'll start out with a challenging question for you: is what about buying in your hay? And that's a question. In the forage world, we've posed that question for many years. In many cases, you may be better off buying in your own hay, or buying in hay off of somebody else. Because the reality is there's a lot of hay that's made that is being sold for less than probably what they have in it. And people don't really realize sometimes what they've got in it. First of all, you got a lower capital investment if you don't have that equipment, lower variable costs with the fertilizer and all the inputs associated with it, and a whole lot less risk, a lot less labor. And you're importing fertilizer. You're importing fertilizer when you buy in your hay. So I strongly encourage folks to consider that as an option. Now, it also depends on how you store it. If you're storing that hay outside on the ground, then yeah, you've got a lot of challenge. And I know that either you have or you will be talking about storage losses in the future as well. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that particular subject. But I've heard every excuse in the world about why not to buy hay, right? And I know there are many folks that are probably thinking this same thing right now: is I can't find the quality of hay that I can make. Well, that very well may be true. I think there's also a fair number of folks, and I'm sure nobody in this audience fits into this category, but there's a fair number of folks that have a rather inflated view of what they produce. The quality of the hay is highly variable, and some folks think that they can produce some really good quality hay, and it may not be quite as good as they think it is. So I'll just leave that there for right now. But I think this is worth asking yourself this question: is if it's better off, if you're not better off buying in your hay, especially in a year like this year. I also think we need to really think about the what's beyond just the total cost of the acre, because it's not just the total cost of the acre that drives your forage cost. Your yield drives your forage cost as well. In fact, there's an argument that could be made that the forage yield is, as the denominator in this equation here, it's one of the major drivers. It's probably even more important to the overall forage cost. Now, that forage cost on a $1 per pound basis is what I think we need to be comparing apples to oranges to. And I want to dispel a common belief that the forage cost is the same thing as forage value. Those two things are not synonymous. I want you just to put your thinking cap. Think about the difference between what it actually cost and what the actual value of that feed is. And if that forage cost is not less than the value of that forage, then you're better off buying in that hay. Now, I don't get into politics, and I especially don't do it now as a federal employee, but I do like this quote, and it's one that's commonly talked about in political circles. Old James Carville, who was a political strategist back in the Clinton era, he always would say, "It's the economy, stupid." When it comes to forages, it's the yield, stupid. You really got to focus on yield. And I apologize for using a little terse language here, but the reality is you got to focus on yield. That's really where you have to begin to really focus on what's happening here. So if we look at this relationship between the total cost and the forage yield, and I told you earlier that my estimation right now is we're looking at about $164 a ton of tall fescue if we're producing 4 tons to the acre on that tall fescue. Now let's take a look at what happens if we change our cost structure or our yields. Let's start with yields. If we reduce our yield, we're going to increase our costs, and it increases at a pretty fast rate. If we lose a half ton of yield to the acre, notice that it's going up $23 a ton right off the bat. If we gain tonnage, if we improve our tonnage, notice what begins to happen here. In fact, we can reduce our per unit cost faster by increasing the tonnage. All right. Now, let's also look at what happens if we can cut cost. Well, if we can cut our costs, and let's say that we're conservatively going to be able to cut 10% off. If we maintain that same yield at 10%, we're going to come out better. It's going to be cheaper on a per ton basis. All right. But if we cut cost, where are we typically going to be cutting cost from? Now, this is the open-ended question. Now, y'all feel free to unmute your mic and volunteer an answer if you want. This is the interactive portion of the program. So what do you think? What happens? Where are we going to cut our cost at?
Fertilizer.
Fertilizer. That's probably the most common answer, right? But what happens if we cut fertilizer? What's most likely to happen if we cut fertilizer?
Yield.
Cut yield. So if we cut our yield, as let's say we cut our cost by 10%, but we ended up costing ourselves a half ton of yield. Notice what's happened here. We are now at $169 a ton instead of $164 a ton. So I guess my caution to you is yield is the most important thing, and we can't really cut corners too much. We can cut some cost, but we have to do so without sacrificing yield. So don't cut cost. Don't cut corners, cut cost. That's the thing we really need to look at. And just to complete the graph here, if we increase our cost, notice that even if we increase our cost and we produce more, we're capable of producing more, we're still better off. So I guess my take home here is that yield is the main driver here, and we need to really focus in on that. All right. The second mistake is fertilizer is out of balance, and that's the elephant in the room. Everybody's talking about fertilizer prices and fuel prices and all the other prices that have inflated. So let's talk about fertilizer for a moment. Now, I just want to go back and reiterate, when we're baling hay, we're removing fertilizer from our fields. And here's a good example. If we're removing 6 tons of hay per acre per year, this is how much fertilizer we're removing from that field, compared to if we're grazing stockers or something like that on that. And if we're removing, well, in this case, it'd be a cow calf and producing a calf. If that calf is coming off, that calf is not removing very many pounds of nutrients. Most of that's being returned. Now, granted, if you don't manage your grazing right, all those nutrients are being returned, but it's under the shade tree or around the water trough, right? You don't have that opportunity to spread it around unless you do good grazing management. But what I would say is, we are removing a lot of nutrients in those hay bales, and every one of those hay bales should be looked at as a bag of fertilizer. So here's a typical nitrogen response rate curve, all right? Now this is a rather generic one. This is from some work in Georgia. The response rate is going to be a little different depending on where you're at and your soil type and your yield potential in your particular site. But this is a pretty typical one. And as we increase our nitrogen rate, our forage yield goes up. That's a pretty typical response. But what I want to draw your attention to is how we make sense of this informs us, how this informs us. So if we consider that to be the average response, the normal response, every 50-pound increase in this range, every 50-pound increase is going to result in an additional 1,200 pounds of forage. So now if we take 1,200 pounds and divide it by 50 pounds, that gives us 24 pounds of forage for every pound of added nitrogen. Okay, so put a pin in that number for just a moment. 24 pounds for every pound of added nitrogen we put out there right now. All right, 24 for every pound of nitrogen. Now, here's the thing, is that green line represents the average, but there are some places that are going to be above average, and there are going to be some places that are below average. And you got to remember what your farm is. You need to understand, is it going to be more productive than average, or is it going to be less productive than average? Because that ratio of the amount of forage that is produced per pound of nitrogen in those below normal conditions, for fescue, it might be around 18-1. But in those high yielding conditions, it might be 30-1. All right. So just keep in mind that your results may vary. Just like those late night infomercials, your results are going to vary. All right. Let me talk a little bit about our one trick, though, that we can apply, and that is to split our nitrogen fertilization. One common mistake that producers make is they'll try to put all of their fertilizer on at one time. And you really only need to put on enough that crop can use it. If we put on too high of a rate at one time, we end up with some challenges. First of all, long term, by splitting our nitrogen, yields generally increase by about 5 to 10%. And the pound of nitrogen that we put on results in 25 to 30% more forage for that particular point in time. So if we spoon feed it, we get better response. It also gives us an opportunity to put more on at a certain time of the year and less on at other times of the year and still make an economic response. But this is especially important when we start talking about extremes. And I'm talking mainly about weather extremes, leaching, too much rain, where we have so much rain that nitrogen leaches down through the soil profile and beyond the reach of the plant. The other extreme, of course, is drought. If we put all that fertilizer on and aren't able to really utilize it, then that drought can cause us problems. And then we also have issues with some late freezes. That's more of a problem with some of our summer species. Volatilization, if we lose that urea-based nitrogen fertilizer to the atmosphere, which we're wont to do, it's in a humid environment like in Tennessee, we're going to lose quite a bit of that urea to volatilization if we don't protect it with a urease inhibitor. So it also helps to prevent nitrate toxicity. So I want to really drill deeper here, though, in how we split those nitrogen applications. And I want to talk about the seasonal differences between the response of these different crops to that nitrogen. All right. Let's talk about fescue to start with. In the early part of the season, right now, that nitrogen that you all put out maybe a week or two ago, that nitrogen should give you between 25 to 35 pounds of forage for every pound of nitrogen you put out there. All right. But now as we get into late May and into June, we're trying to get a second cutting in the spring, we may only get 10 to 20 pounds of forage for every pound of nitrogen we put out there. Then in the fall of the year, if we're stockpiling tall fescue, maybe that is anywhere from 10 to 25. So results are highly variable there in the fall. If we're looking at Bermuda grass normally is going to be most productive in the middle part of the season. That first cutting's pretty good, but it's that second cutting where you make the best on Bermuda grass, generally speaking. And that's true also as you get further deep south into the tipped 85 country, you very much get a good response there. Okay. Now, I want to show you this though. Keep in mind, we know that tall fescue is going to be in that 25 to 30 range right at this time of the year. Right now, nitrogen on a $1 per pound basis is somewhere around $1 to $1.05, maybe a little bit more than that. In fact, I think when I penciled it out, I was being very conservative and I figured $1.14. All right. So pay attention to this far right column as we go through this. So what this is saying is at 30 pounds of response, if it costs us $1 to put that nitrogen out there, it's costing us about 3 cents to get a pound, 3 cents per pound of dry matter. Now, right now, if you were to look at corn gluten prices just as an example, corn gluten prices are roughly between 4 and 5 cents per pound. So what I'm getting at is you got to think about what your substitute is. What are the other alternatives that are out there? As a rule of thumb with hay, we want to keep this $1 per pound of dry matter. We want to keep it less than about 4 cents, less than 4 cents per pound of dry matter. And so right now with fescue, the only profitable time to be putting nitrogen on fescue is in the spring of the year. Given nitrogen prices right now, that's really, based on what I can tell, that's really the only profitable time to be putting on nitrogen fertilizer on fescue. Now, in Bermuda grass, we can get a better response out of Bermuda grass. But for fescue, it really needs to be where we're going to get at least 25 pounds of dry matter for every pound of nitrogen we put out there. Okay. All right. Let me give you a potassium fertilizer trick as well. Now, potassium is one that is often forgot about, and it's often the first one that it goes whenever fertilizer prices go up. But I can assure you, if you want to keep a stand of any grass, whether we're talking about Bermuda grass, especially Bermuda grass, but also tall fescue, orchard grass, any of the cool season species, if we don't adequately fertilize with potassium, we're going to run short and we're going to lose stands. And one of the common refrains that I've heard over the past 15, 20 years is that we're losing stands, whether it's Bermuda grass or tall fescue or whatever it is. And oftentimes when I go to troubleshoot on it, and I've probably done that 100 times while I was in Georgia, actually go to the field and we pull samples, and sure enough, the potash levels are not anywhere close to where they need to be. So one potassium fertilization trick is to split your potash fertilizer. You want to put on about half of it in the spring of the year and the other half in the mid to late season. All right. Now for fescue, that would be in the fall of the year, about the time that you stockpile. You would stockpile fescue at August, September timeframe, and that's when you would want to put on that second application of potash. Now, why do we split the potash application? Well, Plants are what we call luxury consumers. They're kind of to a Chinese buffet where I can have all I can eat, right? And if I have an all I can eat buffet, I'm going to eat as much as I can. And the plants will be the same way. And they'll take up as much potash as they possibly can. And sometimes that's a detriment to what they can use when they need it is much later. So just keep in mind that if you put on too much early in the season, they're going to take too much away from you early in that season as well. The other thing, and this is probably one of the most important things that I'm going to talk about tonight. There's 3 or 4 real take-home messages, and this is one of them. Do not cut back on lime. This is a big deal. This is job number 1. Okay. Now let me show you why this is important. And this is example that I gave from a tall fescue producer when I first got to Georgia. And in 2006, 2007, there was a huge run up in fertilizer prices then. And deja vu, here we are. It's all over again. We're getting it again. And this is exactly what I counseled with this producer about. And this is using his data for a tall fescue field. And I'm going to share with you this example. He brought in a sample, and that sample had a soil pH of 5.6. And the target pH for tall fescue is 6.2. All right. So what's the difference between a pH of 5.6 and a pH of 6.2? Well, if you look at these figures here on the left, the wider the column or the wider this range here, the more available that nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, etc. are. So the wider it is, the more available the nutrient is. And at a pH of 6.2, we get wide availability of nitrogen and phosphorus and potash. Now let's look at 5.6. You notice how much more narrow that is, especially with phosphorus, but it's even with nitrogen, that adds up pretty quickly. Even with potash, we're getting a little bit less availability of that fertilizer. So let's look at that in terms of dollars and cents right now. But before I do that, I want to ask a quick question of those of you who may have bought lime recently. Within the last, say, 4 or 5 months, has anybody priced lime lately? What does it cost in your area of Tennessee?
In Smith County, we can get it for about $7 a ton.
7?
Yep. Yep. Not spread, but as far as the lime itself, that's about what it is.
It's good to be in
We have a mine in the county, so we're blessed with a pretty good source.
Yeah, I figured that was probably the case. And where I grew up in Kentucky, it was the same thing. By the way, I grew up in a lime and fertilizer spreading business alongside our farming operation. So we were blessed where I grew up in Western Kentucky to have quite a bit of limestone around too. And big parts of Tennessee have the same thing. So you probably would add what, another $20 a ton to spread that?
Correct. Yes.
So about $27. We'll just call it $30 an acre spread cost for 1 ton of lime. All right. So now let's keep that number in mind as we go through the following example. So if we were to fertilize tall fescue the way it needs to be and assume a medium level of fertility, and this is this guy's actual real world data. The recommendation for his hayfield at that time was 200 pounds of nitrogen. I figured $1.14 or $1.14 a pound for that nitrogen. Again, ultra conservative. But the difference between 6.2 and 5.6 in terms of efficiency of that nitrogen, we're not going to get the use of about 35% of that nitrogen. So in other words, 35% of that 200 pounds, we're not going to really get the use out of. We're going to lose it. And that cost us about $80 an acre. We do the same thing for phosphorus and potash. The total is $110 per acre of lost fertilizer value. Now, all of a sudden, that $30 an acre for a spread ton cost of lime, which is what would be necessary for that producer to correct that pH. A ton of lime is a good deal. Lime is almost always going to pay for itself. If your soil fertility, if your soil test recommends it, it's almost always going to pay for itself. Now, I also want to give you some fertilizer strategies and to think about your whole farm. And this is that same guy's farm operation here. And I'm going to walk you through these fields. This is his primary hay field. All right, this is one of them. This is the pH and the P and the K, etc. Here is a different hay field. He also had another one that was on another property, and that was the subject of that previous discussion. But hayfields 2 and 3 here, even though it was separated with a barrier there, there's some trees in between. Hayfield, all right. The pH there is 5.5, low phosphorus, low potash. And when he started looking at what the fertilizer recommendations was in hayfield 2 and 3, he realized pretty quickly, my golly, that's going to be expensive. And so we got to looking at this aerial photograph and looking at soil samples. Now he had soil samples on every field in this farm, which it came to really serve him well here. I said, this field over here sure does look good. He said, yeah, that was a field that we established in some good fescue 2 or 3 years earlier, really nice and uniform. I said, can you hay that field? He said, yeah, it lays pretty well. I can hay it. I said, well, can you graze over in this field? He said, yeah, I've got some water up around here, and I got another water spot down around here. I could graze in these fields if I needed to. I said, well, let's look at the soil pH and the soil fertility here in this field. So we pulled up the soil fertility here, and in this pasture, he had a really good pH level, very good phosphorus level, and very good potash level. So what I convinced him to do is to hay this field and graze over here, spend some time and try to raise the fertility slowly over here and live off a bit of a banked amount of soil fertility over in this field. And that's what he ended up doing. He was able to flip-flop here and make it work. So I really encourage you to think about this holistically. And Chris, I don't know what you all charge in Tennessee to do soil tests, but I found that to be a very reliable, cost-effective strategy to get a good soil test. And this, I don't know what it was at the time. I think it was $6 a test at that time to get it tested, and that saved him thousands of dollars that particular year by having it. And that's just one example. I'm not saying that's going to be how it's going to work for everybody, but it is something of great importance, I think. Now, the number 4 mistake that I think people make is, and I've seen this time and time and time again, is scalping and scalloping a field. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me walk you through this. We've seen an evolution of hay equipment over the past 30 years or so. And I remember as a kid, when disc mowers first came out, my granddaddy come home with one for the first time, and he was so proud of that thing and realized he could cut that grass all the way down to the ground. I could get every bale out of that field. Well, that turned out to be a big mistake, because what mowers, yeah, you can shave the ground, you can make it look like a pile carpet, but the problem is if you cut that too short, you're going to cause some major problems for your hay fields. So I really encourage folks to think about adjusting their hay equipment so that their disc mowers especially are not slammed down to the ground like it's shown here, that it's raised up. These pictures actually are from, I apologize, the blurry nature of the text there. This is actually from a UT publication that Pat Kaiser put together. There are adjustments that can be made on just about every mower, and some of those, some of the mowers actually come with feet that go on the bottom of it. You can raise the bottom of that cutter bar by putting on the feet on it to raise it up. You can also use things like these cylinder collars to keep it from going down quite as far. But follow the manufacturer's recommendations, of course, about how to do that. But the point is, you really want to avoid cutting off too much grass. You always want to have a little bit of green leaf material left there, and you certainly don't want to cut off the storage, especially on fescue and orchard grass. The savings account of that plant is primarily in the first 3 inches above the soil surface. It's in the stems. That's where it stores fructose. And that fructose is what gives that plant the energy to grow back until it creates new green leaf material. It has to operate off of reserves, its savings account. So we really need to be careful about scalping those plants and avoiding a situation where we take off and remove too much of that reserve. Here's another challenge that we often run into, and this is a field after about about 3 weeks of growth, and you see that scalloped field. That scalloped nature is where that cutter bar was tilted too far forward. If it's tilted too far forward, you end up getting really close to the ground at the front, and on the sides you don't get as much cut, and you end up with this scalloped look across the field. So be careful about tilting it too far. Oftentimes folks will try to tilt it when they're trying to lift a crop that has been down somehow, but you want a good level angle as you go across that field. This is something I want you to really drive home. I want this to be, if you don't remember anything else I talk about tonight, remember this. Letters. Grass grows grass. If we leave grass material out there, it will grow back faster. It will grow back with better quality. It will grow back and be a stronger stand. It'll have less weeds in it. This is a core principle that we really, I think, often forget about when we're getting ready to cut a hayfield, that if we leave a little bit out there, it will grow back faster and stronger. And if you don't believe me, I think you've all, if you've been in a hayfield, if you ever cut hay, you know, if you've seen that little place that you didn't quite cut down as short as the other places, you know it grows back faster. You've seen it grow back faster, and it's ready to harvest a week or two before everything else is. And that's a main principle that we really need to drive home. Okay. Number 5, I'm not going to spend hardly any time talking about storage losses because it is going to be a subject you're going to talk about in another time. But failing to minimize storage losses is in the top 5 of the mistakes that people make in managing their hay. Storing hay outside on the ground, that is a huge loss. If we look at the overall components of forage waste, and I'm going to hit on the first two here, field curing and harvesting. I think other speakers are going to address storage and feeding losses. But field curing and harvest losses are significant. In the field, and I'm not talking about rain damage here, I'm talking about how we handle that in the field. In the field, we can lose anywhere from 5 to 25% of the dry matter. In the handling of it during harvest, especially in the baling, the raking and the baling operation, we may lose as much as 7 to 15% of the dry matter. Now, if we're talking principally about grasses, we're going to be on the low end of this range. If we're talking about alfalfa or clover or something like that, we're going to be on the higher end of that range. All right. Now, of course, we have rainfall and leaching. When we get rainfall events, it sometimes will leach some of the sugars out of the crop, but we also have respiration. Respiration losses do occur, and they go on until we reach about 47% moisture. All right. So let's talk about drying times. And for some reason, when I copied my files over from the UGA presentation folder to my USDA one. It screwed up my dates on the bottom here, so just bear with me. Under good drying conditions, we can get this down. This should be day 3 right here, by the way. I apologize for the error there. But under good drying conditions, we should get down to our target moisture of about 15% moisture within about 3 days. All right. But under poor drying conditions, that might last 5 days, 6 days, and might even go longer than that, if depending on how things go. But I also want to point out something else, is that we do get nighttime fluctuations. Notice that even when it's relatively moist, it will pick up some moisture. And those high humid nights, moisture is driven back into the crop. If that moisture in the air is greater than the moisture in the crop, it will drive moisture back into the crop. And that can be a real challenge for us. Now, the goal here, we want to try to get this down below about 47%, roughly about 50%. We want to drop it below 50% as quickly as possible, because we do get a fair amount of respiration losses. Just like if you were to have a banana sitting out on the counter, it's going to respire and it's going to start deteriorating. That crop is doing the same thing, especially if it's a high sugar crop. Now, for mowers, we've got a number of different mower options out there. And I've talked already about sickle bars versus disc mowers, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time comparing those, but I do want to compare the conditioner styles. So when we run either with an impeller or the flail type conditioner, or a roller crimper style conditioner, we can greatly accelerate our drying rate, and it dries a lot faster. I'll show you some data on this in a moment. But what I do want to point out is these are two very different things, and it depends on what you're trying to harvest with these as to which ones you should use. If you're using grasses or finer stem grasses, especially like Bermuda grass, a flail or impeller style conditioner is the best. If we're talking about something like alfalfa or something that's got a real thick stem to it, a roller crimper is going to be better. All right. So depending on where you're at, in Georgia, when I was down there, they didn't really sell very many roller crimpers. It was all flail conditioners. It may be that way in Tennessee as well. I'm not sure. Just wanted to show this is what happens with the roller crimper, is that in an alfalfa stem, it just crushes it and it squeezes some of that water out of it, as well as opens up more area for that to dry out. I'm going to skip over some of this in the interest of time. I want to get to this. The main point I want to drive home on conditioners. If we have no conditioner and we add our buddy Ted out here and we ted that crop, over the control of no conditioner, no tedding, just the tedding operation alone will increase our drying rate by about 17%. Now, this was done on alfalfa, but this is generally true also for our grasses as well. A roller crimper, compared to no tedding and no conditioner, increased at about 18%, but the combination of the tedding and the roller crimper increased their drying rate by about 50%. Steel flail, very similar. There's also a plastic flail impeller style, and that's the result that you can see there. The bottom line is the addition of the conditioner will add about 20% increase in drying rate. The addition of a tedder will increase your drying rate by about 20%. But if you add them together, it'll boost it up to about 50% increase in drying rate. That can mean the difference between getting it baled on one day or 3 days later, or it can mean an added day or two of extra drying time if we're not careful. I've got some more slides in here than what I've got time to present, and I'm going to skip over this one, but I'm happy to provide these slides for your perusal later if you'd like to look at them in more detail. But I do want to cut to the chase here. on hay curing management. Should we use a conditioner? I think you should. I think conditioning, a conditioner really does help. It does accelerate the drying. Should we lay that swath out wide or narrow? If we're making hay, you want that swath laid pretty well as wide as you possibly can do it. To a point, if we're making alfalfa hay, we can knock a lot of leaves off by driving over it. So we want to be careful of that. But generally speaking, with grass hay, wide as possible. You need as much sunlight as possible. Your best friend with drying your hay down is sunlight. So the more sun that you can intercept, the better off you're going to be. When should I mow? I often get this question about when should I mow? Should I mow in the afternoon or should I mow in the morning? Well, I guess it fundamentally breaks down to how much faith do you have in your weatherman? You know, when I was growing up, I was told that little boys that lie grow up to be weathermen. Now, that's a joke, and I don't mean to disparage any out there, but the reality is that in the summertime, it's hard to predict what the weather's going to do. And if you get up in the morning and you've got 3 days in the forecast of pretty good drying conditions, generally speaking, that 3-day window, you probably are going to be able to get it in. But now as it gets out to day 4 or 5, they're going to be a bit more unable to predict with accuracy how good those drying conditions are going to be. So if you get up in the morning and it says the next 3 days are going to be dry, well, you probably better be out there on the mower and laying it down rather than waiting until in the evening. Even though the sugar levels are going to go up, over the course of the drying conditions of drying overnight, you're still going to lose quite a bit of that respiration. It's still going to take several days or several hours at least to get down below 50% moisture, and you're still going to lose some respiration. So go ahead and mow early as possible. Now, if you're trying to make baleage cutting, you want to do that in the afternoon because you do want that high amount of soluble sugars there so that you wilt it overnight and you bale it the next morning to make baleage in a high drying environment anyway. Should we ted it? Yes, but only when damp and toward the end of when the dew is on. Usually if you're tedding after 11 o'clock in the morning, you've waited too late. It needs to be done before then. You need to avoid tedding legumes when it's greater than 50% moisture. Moisture at raking, most of your grasses, we can rake those at around 20% moisture and then bale it whenever it gets to our target moisture, about 15%. Now with legumes, sometimes you want to rake those at a little bit higher moisture and let it cure out the rest of the way in the windrow. Now you've got to have a good fluffy windrow to do that, but it is advisable to do that to try to minimize leaf loss, leaf shatter, dry matter loss there. Moisture at baling, if we're making round bales, which most folks are going to be doing these days, 15% is your target. Now I'm not saying that's going to be perfect, and sometimes you can miss a target and still be okay, but sometimes you can hit 15% and still get a little bit of heating going on. So just be aware that 15% is kind of the target. You can go a little lower than that, but it's hard to do that in the humid east.